Welcome back to Season 2 of That's So Second Millennium, the Catholic Science podcast, where we look forward to the new synthesis in the new millennium between faith, philosophy, and science. Welcome back to the That's So Second Millennium podcast. I'm Paul Giesting, and I'm privileged to be joined by Father John Hollowell of the Archdiocese of Indianapolis. He is the chaplain at DePauw University, which we'll have to have a little bit of a carnival sideshow about that because I am a double legacy from Wabash. My father and my brother both went to Wabash, so we'll have to, those of you who don't understand why that's an important thing, we'll have to educate you about that. He is also the chaplain at the Putnamville Correctional Institution, and he has a very active social media presence. And if I'm remembering correctly, you were also a math major in college, so there's a lot of interesting material for us to sort of unpack there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so, we'd like to start with both your intellectual and your spiritual formation, how you wound up where you're at.
Yeah, well, I am, let's see, trying to think here. I guess the best place would be, I just was thinking about being an engineering major at Purdue University through high school and got pretty close to going. I actually went to Purdue for 1 year and loved that. I've always just kind of, math's always come easy. But I felt the call. Actually, right, like a couple days before I went to register at Purdue, I felt the call to be a teacher, which I had never really thought much about. And so I switched majors right before registering, so I guess I didn't even switch, but I just registered to be a math teacher at Purdue and loved Purdue. It was great, but then I missed athletics. I played sports in high school, so I ended up transferring to Hanover College, a small liberal arts college in Indiana, but kept the math and the teaching background going, and that's what I ended up getting a degree in. But and did that for about 2 years at a Catholic high school. But even while I was still at Hanover, I pretty much made the decision over a course of a couple of years to eventually go to the seminary after I had used my math teaching for a couple of years. And that's what I did. I taught at a Catholic high school for 2 years, and then went to the seminary for 6 years in southern Indiana. So.
Okay. Yeah, down at St. Meinrad.
Yep.
So, what school did you teach at?
It was a Catholic high school on the north side of Indianapolis called Bishop Chittard High School.
Okay. Yeah. All right. And then you went to the seminary, and that would put you at the age of what, 24, 25 when you entered seminary?
Right. Yep. And so then I was ordained a priest in 2009 at the age of 30, and then I just turned 40 and celebrated my 10th anniversary of ordination this summer.
Okay, yeah, that makes us exactly the same age, basically. So. Okay, all right. Born in 79, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
So. All right. So what have you done? What was your? I take it. This is a question. Even though my brother was in seminary for a couple of years, he was in the pre-theology. He left after 2 years. He was going for the Diocese of Lafayette, so he was at the Josephinum over in Columbus. Sure. I would guess that at some point during your theology training, you do at least do a little bit of specialization, something that attracts you a little bit more than whether it's patristics or the Bible or systematic theology or what have you.
Yeah, I would say, there's, in terms of there isn't really an opportunity before ordination, I think, to specialize typically, other than just kind of, they give you, as with most college or, programs like that, you get the opportunity to take electives. And so I ended up taking most of mine in kind of counseling and, just kind of working in the psychology realm. But yeah, then certainly after you're ordained a priest, dioceses need guys that have gotten, doctorates in patristics and moral theology, canon law, and so you'll usually get sent on for graduate doctorate work in those areas. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what have your assignments been since you were ordained?
Sure. My first 3 years, I was my main job was a chaplain and teacher at Cardinal Ritter High School, which is on the west side of Indianapolis, and just kind of threw myself into that. But then I was also on the weekends helping out at a suburban parish in Brownsburg, Indiana, called St. Malachy. So I did that for 3 years, and then I've been out in western Indiana for the last 7 years, working in Brazil, Indiana, at Annunciation, and then I have a parish in Greencastle called St. Paul's, and that also has DePauw University as outreach.
Okay. Yeah, and that, of course, brings us to two things, because my actual intellectual background is as a geologist, and so the fact that you're in Brazil, I had a friend from high schools in Brazil for a few years. His mother was a Methodist minister, and I believe that had been their previous assignment. So I heard that. Is that still active there, or is that sort of have the mines shut down?
The mines have basically shut down. Yeah. Yep.
So is that sort of a challenge for that particular parish and community? Yeah.
It's certainly it's a poor area of Indiana, but we have some manufacturing that's come in and provides good work for people that would like that. Yeah.
And then of course there's DePauw. How big is DePauw these days?
They're hurting a little bit for enrollment, I think, with a lot of universities. So I think it's down to about 2,200 students, I want to say,
2,200
right now.
Students, yeah. Which still makes them, twice the size of Wabash or something like that?
Yeah, right. Yeah. I think they need about 2,400, I think they said, is kind of the ideal budget-wise. But so they're down a little bit, but yeah. Yeah, and of course, for those of you at home who may not be aware of the greatest college football rivalry in existence, DePauw and Wabash have been playing for an old railroad locomotive bell called the Monon Bell for a very long period of time now. So that's right. Yeah.
Many hijinks have ensued.
This just shows the power of Christ to unite people, that you and I are able to talk to each other.
That's right. Just coming across these, there's practically barbed wire and trenches and everything between Crawfordsville and Greencastle. No, it is funny though. It is a long and hilariously storied history. If you cared to look into that, if you had half an hour to kill reading about the history of the Monon Bell, is one of the better ways you could spend it. But So what has have you, as a college chaplain, what kind of intellectual, so we talk a lot on this podcast about the relationship between science and religion, and obviously the Catholic faith in particular. Have you experienced you're someone with boots on the ground in terms of that whole culture, and that potentially that belief being current among contemporary young people, that the Catholic faith in particular and science are just, we heard about Galileo, right? So we're not going to worry about that silly superstition anymore. How has that played out for you in your role there at DePauw?
Yeah, it was certainly something that I try to preach about on a fairly regular basis. The studies, all point to the fact that it's the number one reason that people are leaving. Among young adults and even teens. I think there was a study that showed that the average age now is like 13, where you're breaking away from Catholicism. So we try to hit that point. Last year is kind of our opening rollout of our religious ed for our young adults, our K through 8. I sent a thing out to the parents that had, here's a link to 400 scientists from the scientific revolution who were priests or Catholic lay people, and just kind of trying to make that the front edge. We've really kind of moved that relationship of science and faith to really the front of what we're trying to present to all of our people, religious ed-wise, and also like in my preaching, I try to hit that a lot. And then, so those would be the main things that come to mind.
And what? How about the students themselves? Are there some of the students there who have gotten active in that, trying to change the cultural narrative there, just at DePauw or in the wider world?
Yeah, we've been blessed. We had a friend of mine from high school went to DePauw, and she became a medical doctor, and she now does like natural family planning, Catholic medicine in Indianapolis, and has this booming practice. And so we have had her come out and talk to our parish and students and stuff, and I think just kind of highlighting that. And so we have certainly some alumni who fall into that category. And then just trying to, I think our faculty, trying to develop relationships with our faculty, whether, Catholic or not, trying to go on, just anything that we can do to kind of address that narrative. We're certainly, I think trying to do, and have had some success with that. I think it's always an uphill battle, of course, because it goes back, to the scientific revolution, and at least, where the narrative is that we're just absolutely oil and water, Catholicism, science, and so I think we have an uphill battle, but I think we're trying to do what we can.
Yeah. Hang on just a second. One thing, I've noticed you have a fairly active social media presence. You have a blog, and active on several Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I don't get Instagram, I have to admit. I'm part of me is just stuck in the 20th century. I was very much, I was born in the 70s, but I was reading stuff from the 50s for a lot of my youth, and there's part of me that's just kind of frozen in time.
Yeah,
but,
it's funny because for me, I don't mind Instagram. And in fact, like all the studies show that that's where all of our college students are at. And so we used it for that purpose particularly. But my threshold is actually Snapchat. I downloaded Snapchat for like 10 minutes and tried to use it, and I'm like, I'm just having to draw the line here. I can't do this. So I've cut it off at Snapchat, but there's certainly lots of priests doing Snapchat and have that I think covered. So you just have to figure out what you can handle and do that, and
that's right.
Not try and overextend.
We all have different gifts. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So, well, so we had we talked to a lot of speakers at the Society of Catholic Scientists conference. It was in Notre Dame back in June, and we've talking a lot about life issues because the theme of the conference was, what is human? What does it mean to be human? And so we talked to people like Maureen Kondik, who is a bioethicist out at Utah, who had was a very controversial figure for the wider world because of her stance during the big debates about embryonic stem cells and things like that. So I know that you've weighed in on some of these issues and some of the sort of warfare that's been going on, so to speak, I guess, over that subject, especially in the last couple of years. So is there would you like to go into that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I think it's a great, as John Paul II said in, his letter on kind of the relationship between faith and science, faith and reason, truth never contradicts truth. And I think that, in the sort of research being done and with embryos and, all of the larger pro-life discussion, I think we just see it's a great, because it's relevant and it's really important. And then B, just, it's just so intense. I think it's a great way where we can see, like, look, our faith it doesn't contradict science, and it has something to contribute to the scientific discussion. Because, I think when you talk about that kind of stuff, the building blocks of life and humanity, I think no matter what someone's coming from faith background-wise, it's a really big stretch. Not that there aren't completely materialistic people, but when you start talking about human people and embryos and babies, it really gets pretty hard to say that there's nothing there other than just physical matter, And so it provides an opportunity to say, okay, like, can we all at least admit that, like, we all recognize that something important is happening here? And if that's the case, then maybe, just maybe, faith has something to contribute here, that can help shed a light on this. And then also, particularly, I think, pointing to specific examples of people who have been in the field for a long time, doing contributing research and things that people respect, to have those, to point to those specific people and say, these people, here are doing what they're doing, and they're talking about how they're motivated by their faith, right? I mean, as Paul VI said it way back in the 60s, I think, that people don't listen to teachers anymore, they listen to witnesses. And so to get up and, to have me as a priest, get up and lecture about pro-life embryo stuff, doesn't carry as much weight. But I mean, when we can point to, like, here's a scientist in the field doing work who says that he's doing what, or she's doing what she's doing because she's a Catholic, and that she sees no contradiction in her scientific work and her faith, I mean, that speaks way more to my young people than me speaking about it.
Right.
So I just think that's why those kind of things are just super important right now.
Yeah. That role of needing witnesses to talk about. Yeah. And the whole, I mean, what you said earlier about, if we're really, it's interesting. So there's this, public intellectual, Steven Pinker, neuroscientist. And I read some of his book. I read sort of the first third of his book, The Blank Slate. And it's fascinating because he takes, his sort of fellow progressives. I mean, it gets to the point where it's hard to call him a progressive in this, the sense that most of us would understand it. Because he's taking them to task with their positions not being logically consistent. That, on one sense, they try to claim that they're materialist, and that allows them to sweep religion away and sweep it under the rug and regard it as, something that history is just going to gradually rid us of. And the faster we do that, the better. But at the same time, they have all sorts of other beliefs that really aren't consistent with materialism at all. And he tries to call them on that. I don't think he even does a complete enough job of it, actually, but at least it's a start, and it's an interesting point of, and that it is so strange. The last 400 years of intellectual history are so amazingly contorted in the sense that, so there was, the science itself comes out of scholasticism. I mean, it's hard to deny those connections, although people do regularly. That sort of Whig history of the scientific revolution, that it just sort of arose out of nothing.
It's like that. I mean, it's such a caricatured version of history. I heard once there's a book on the Middle Ages that I love, and it's by Regine Pernaud, and she just says that you can say almost anything you want about the Middle Ages and be pretty sure no one's going to contradict you, because no one. I mean, 99% of people have not read the history, and I mean, it's amazing when you go back and read that history. It's just the cartoon version that, the church kept its foot on science and intellectual, and then finally, once everybody got free of that, then science happened. The opposite, as you just said, I mean, like, the opposite is true. When you go back and look at the history unbiased, you're going to see that, without the sort of scholastic view of creation and the Catholic view of creation, that it's A, intelligible, and that B, it's worth knowing, that's what clears the way for scientific resolution, and is why out of all of the people leading the way in the scientific revolution, the vast majority of them are Catholics and priests.
Right.
It's the Big Bang Theory being created by a Catholic priest. Everyone thinks that, the Big Bang Theory, disproves Catholicism, and it's well, it didn't for the guy that came up with it, who was a priest.
Exactly. And the guy who came up with it, dedicated himself, among other things, to restraining the Pope from being too enthusiastic about it. I mean, that's that's bizarre to try to claim that the Big Bang disproves Catholicism when it's something that people of an atheist bent were horrified by, because they would much rather the universe be eternal, as if that could work either, but that's another story. But they had sort of hung their hats on that.
Right. And then it's like, and I always told my students, I was teaching classes and stuff, it's like, okay, when you go look at the history of the Galileo event, like, it's amazing, like, it's a great story. Like, and it's awesome. I mean, it's just, it's fascinating from, like, a human interaction, between the Pope and Galileo, and that they knew each other, and there was a little bit of a friendship. I mean, there's so much to that story that's interesting and fascinating, and no one knows it. And, and then the other thing about it, I always tell people, is like, okay, if, let's say for a second that the church actually hated and persecuted Galileo. I grew up in a Catholic school, and my understanding of it, I assumed that the church tortured and killed Galileo.
Right.
But when, even if you want to say that, which none of that happened, of course, and it's all cleared up by a simple reading of about 5 minutes about the actual story.
Yeah.
Show us one other scientist who was persecuted by the church.
Right.
Like, if we had this great war against science, like, who else besides Galileo? And no one, the vast majority of students can't, because there isn't really anybody else.
Yeah, exactly. And nor do we choose to remember. I mean, we're blessed to live at this point. John Paul II weighed in pretty forcefully on what the actual resolution of the Galileo issue should be from the standpoint of the official church. I mean, he released 2 documents that were basically, that was what the Pope and cardinals did at that time was a miscarriage of justice in that specific case, and we totally repudiate that. End of story.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And that's and that got forgotten completely.
Catholicism has nothing to fear, right, from, like, authentic science nor authentic history. But unfortunately, like, not many people know authentic history.
No.
And that's why we're kind of behind the 8 ball.
Yeah. People are not patient enough to weigh into that. I mean, that was what you mentioned earlier. I thought it was an interesting point, that statistically people, intellectually have left the church by age 13. I'm like, I was actually, like, probably even a year or 2 ahead of that curve, honestly. When I was a kid, I went through this whole phase where I was definitely an atheist at the age of 12 or 13. And what actually happened is that at age 14, I had a kind of a conversion experience related to, just stuff going on at that age. Go into the details of that. But it was followed up by, what God chose to follow that up with was, for whatever reason, I went down into the basement and I picked up, I don't know if it belonged to my father, probably something he took in college. But he had a copy of this old paperback, it was current and still into the 90s. You could find it in bookstores, but it was black and had this weird abstract art on the cover, but it was a translation of the Inferno by this 20th century poet named John Ciardi. And so I read this, and I have no idea what I picked it up and thought I was going to get out of. I mean, it was an old book, and I wanted to read it. I've always loved old things. I was a geologist and a classics major. Just give me the old things, and nobody gets hurt. All right, I just want to find out. I just want to find out. So I read it, and I was just fascinated. I was blown away by, because he has to give us all these historical notes on, the figures involved, and of course all of the 13th and 14th century Italian figures that he talks about that none of us would get anymore because it's politics of the time, and all that fascinating little romance that we don't know anymore. But also the intellectual currents of the time, and by the time I had, at least by the time I had finished the Purgatorio, which I had to go out and buy the Purgatorio after I'm like, the story goes on. Wait, there's more of this book. By the time I'd finished that, I was, I had somehow gotten introduced to the whole, the whole world of the scholastic, synthesis of the 13th and 14th century. And I just, so up to that point, I had been very concerned about this whole, there's no connection between, here's this Bible over here and it says all of these things, and then I have this, book about the universe, this, pop-up book of the universe from the late 80s, and so that sort of encapsulates for me the whole scientific
side of things. Like, well, these just tell different stories. This tells a completely different history. And at that age, my reading ability was pretty high, but my critical ability was somewhere lagging, fairly far behind that. And but I was struck by, people have done this before. People have integrated their science and their faith before. I bet we can do that again. And I can't really give a complete explanation for just how firmly that conviction was already, embedded in my mind at age 14. But it was, and nothing I've learned since, would lead me to believe otherwise.
Right.
But again, people don't know that history. People don't, people just aren't curious, and that's always terrified me.
Right. No, absolutely. And we live in a world, right? That really discourages, that sort of looking back anyway, right? Because all that's really that with the situation and social media and everything, it's like, I think a lot of our young people today kind of believe that it's basically like, if it didn't happen, within the last couple of years, it's not relevant, because everything prior to a couple of years ago was sort of knuckle dragging,
right?
Neanderthals,
right? Those homophobic, patriarchal, blah 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 blah.
Right. So it's unfortunate, but I mean, it is what it is, and it's the uphill battle that we have at the moment. But
to try to encourage people somehow, finding what the positive is, we can encourage people to sort of go a little bit deeper than the froth of the contemporary, like you say, social media in particular, crowding out our ability to do anything deeper than that, to think about anything deeper than that.
Right.
Well, I really appreciate you making the time. Is there any words you'd like to sum up with here at the end?
No, nothing comes to mind. Thanks for being a Catholic scientist and helping fight. You're on the front lines.
We're doing our best. Yeah. We'll try to come out there. It would be great. He mentioned that perhaps I could make it out there to DePauw at some time. I will make sure not to wear my Wabash shirt while I'm on campus. But
we'd love to have you anytime, and keep doing what you're doing and helping, and let me know if I can ever help with anything.
Okay, and we're going to try to get gold masses, at least one going somewhere in central Indiana, maybe in Indianapolis. I think the Dominicans at IU are interested in doing it, so hopefully we can make that happen. So that's another form of outreach, a little public witness that Catholicism and science are, like you said, they're not oil and water. That's a very false picture of it. So
great.
All right.
Great to speak with you.
Thank you so much.
All right.
If you enjoyed this episode, or it made you think, please subscribe to That's So Second Millennium via Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Podbean, or your podcast service of choice.